All right, welcome, happy Earth Day. So let's start by warming up with a question today. So I have a question posted on Socrative. Those of you listening from home, you should also be able to access it on Socrative. All right. Okay. So it looks like there was a healthy majority in favor of the correct answer, which was C, an ectothermic homeotherm. Ectotherm, you would have to just know, basically, that sea stars are ectothermic, right? So good guess if it's not a mammal, if it's not a bird, and if it's not a moth or some kind of bee, it's probably an ectotherm. But you can tell from the description that it's a homeotherm, right? Because it's being kept at pretty much a constant temperature by its environment. Okay, so that's it for, that rounds off the last Socrative question from last time. So we had just gotten into talking about thermoregulation. Remember, we had just talked about like the different ways that you can exchange heat, lose or gain heat. And we had mentioned there was conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. And now we're going to talk about different adaptations that animals have to help them thermoregulate. So there are 5 that we'll talk about: insulation, circulatory adaptations, cooling by evaporative heat loss, behavioral responses, and adjusting metabolic heat. And we'll talk about each of them in turn. So let's talk about insulation first. So mammals use their integumentary system. So this is an organ system that mammals have. Well, it's an organ system that most animals have, right? But mammals use it to thermoregulate. So depending on the mammal, right, some of that thermoregulation will occur with layers of fat underneath the skin. Obviously, sweat, right? Evaporative cooling, as we'll talk about, plays a role. And there are sweat glands, sebaceous glands that are releasing water and oils to help you thermoregulate. And then a lot of mammals also use fur, right, to thermoregulate. So this distinction between hair and fur is a false distinction, right? So you'll hear this sometimes when people talk about like hypoallergenic dogs. It has nothing to do, right? Just what we call hair and what we call fur is meaningless, right? It's all fur, right? And it has more to do with like what happens when mammals are shedding their coat, right? And like sloughing off lots of layers of skin along with that shedding. But anyway, right, so most mammals, marine mammals and humans notwithstanding, right, have a lot of fur on their bodies, and they use this to basically trap air. And air does a really good job insulating, right? If you've ever worn a wetsuit or a dry suit, same principle, right? It traps air inside the suit and prevents it from escaping, and that's what's keeping you warm. Incidentally, some mammals also use fur to communicate, right? As we know, right? Different colorations and things like that, but also behaviorally, right? So anybody had a dog that gets pissed off and it raises that ridge of hair on its back? Yeah. So this is something that also happens in primates. Non-human primates do this all the time. If they get pissed off, all of the little erector muscles on their hair follicles will like make them puff out a little bit more. So chimps do this.
Is that like is a porcupine spine also here?
I believe so. I believe it is also, yeah, a keratin from a follicle, but I could be wrong.
Because it's the same thing as males too, right?
Right, yeah, it's all keratin. Yep. So some mammals also use so they have glands that secrete oils that they then can anoint their fur with, right? So think things like sea otters, right? Sea otters hang out in the ocean which is quite cold, right? Nowhere near their normal body temperature. So they have to eat a ton, first of all, right, to keep up so they have a lot of metabolic heat that they use. But also they have a lot, like really oily fur, right? And that's used to trap heat. So birds use feathers for similar reasons, right? They can accomplish thermoregulation through their integumentary system as well. So a lot of seafaring or aquatic birds have these oils as well that they sort of anoint their feathers with. A lot of marine mammals have a really big layer of fat right underneath their skin, the technical term of which is blubber. It's actually technically called blubber. And that helps them thermoregulate a ton, right? So they can basically maintain body temperatures similar to their terrestrial cousins at no additional metabolic cost, right? Which is kind of bananas if you think about it. So their average expenditure of calories to keep that same body temperature is about the same as land animals, land mammals. Okay, next up we've got circulatory adaptations. Right, so the amount of blood that's permitted to flow onto the outer edges of the body, right, into the skin, definitely affects thermoregulation, right? And you can do two things, right? Endotherms and some ectotherms do this. They regulate blood flow in the body core versus on the skin. So if they vasodilate, that means they're permitting more blood flow, right? They're dilating all the capillaries in their skin, right? So that's permitting more blood to come into closer contact and exchange thermal energy with the air or with the water. And that facilitates heat loss. Okay, someone mentioned elephants, I think, last week or the week before, right? So elephants, African elephants in particular, have these big, really vascularized ears, right? And they're using them basically to cool off, right? To exchange a lot of heat with the air. And the other thing that could happen is you can have vasoconstriction, where capillaries constrict, right? And you reduce blood flow in the skin. Okay, so you can even tell this if you're like walking around outside on a cold day, right? Your skin gets whiter, right? Because all the blood is leaving the surface of your skin. Is this making sense so far? Okay. A couple of different lineages also take advantage of what's called countercurrent exchange. And this is pretty cool. So the idea is you have arteries and veins kind of running in parallel to one another, right? So they're pretty close by. It tends to be on extremities, right? So on limbs that can easily lose heat. So one way to save some of that heat, right, is by allowing arteries, which contain blood coming from the heart, to exchange heat with veins as they are going back to the heart. Okay, the alternative here, if these were to happen in two completely different places and not be allowed to exchange heat, you would lose more heat. So you would be colder, right? You wouldn't be able to gain some of that heat from the arteries giving it off, if that makes sense. Okay, so this is common in a lot of aquatic animals, right? So a lot of endothermic aquatic animals, I should say. So unsurprising things like whales and dolphins have a lot of countercurrent exchange, but also big fish, right? Things like tuna really famously have countercurrent exchange. So tuna have like very high body temperatures despite being fish, right? And they're very fast, right? So they're using a lot of energy. So any little bit of heat that they can save, they'll do it. And also a lot of birds, particularly ones that spend a lot of time near water, right? So like all the plovers and stuff you see walking on the beach, they have all this countercurrent exchange in their legs. Okay, it's not limited just to vertebrates though. Some insects also take advantage of countercurrent exchange, including lots of bees and wasps. So this is a bumblebee. So as I mentioned last quarter, weirdly, the word that describes the structure that connects the abdomen to the thorax of an insect is called a petiole, right? Just like the petiole. Was that this quarter or last quarter? That was this quarter. Okay. So the petiole, right, is this really narrow. You can see it better in wasps, right? It's this really narrow segment, right, that connects the abdomen and the thorax. So all of the hemolymph, right, that has to flow there flows through that tiny little bit of space, right? So that facilitates countercurrent exchange. So bumblebees in particular have to keep their thorax pretty warm because that's where all their flight muscles are. So that's part of the way they do that. Speaking of muscles, someone did ask me about insects and bees in particular having muscle tissue last time. So there's the evidence for that. They do have muscle. Okay. Next up is cooling by evaporative heat loss. Right? We're used to thinking about this because we sweat, right? We are one of the organisms that do this perhaps too prolifically, right? Or whatever. Maybe that's personal experience talking. But we're not the only ones. So a lot of vertebrates use evaporative cooling. So sweating, right? Sweating across the whole body is pretty rare. So it happens in horses. It happens in humans. I can't think of many other species that do it, but I'm sure there are a few. The textbook always suggests that there's more than those two and never goes on to mention what they are. But right, things like dogs pant, so they're exchanging, so they have a really vascularized tissue in their mouths. So there's a lot of blood vessels there, which allow there to be a lot of exchange. And birds. Birds also have a really heavily vascularized pouch under their tongues, right? And they basically pant, right? Same purpose. Alex.
I was just thinking about like hippopotamuses. Don't they have like, I know they sweat, but don't they also have like sunscreen in their sweat or something like that?
I would not be surprised at all. Yeah. Yeah. They're weird.
They also poop themselves to cool down their legs. Birds do, not the hippopotamus.
I would believe it either way. Yeah, that's gonna be a weird Google search later on. Okay. Cool. Then we'll talk about sort of behavioral responses that are involved in thermoregulation as well. So the one that we're used to thinking of is basking, right? You see snakes, lizards, lots of reptiles basking on warm rocks on a sunny day. Insects do this too, right? So you'll often see butterflies or dragonflies basking. If it gets too hot, right, dragonflies can basically close their wings and shift the angle of their abdomen. So instead of pointing sort of perpendicular to the sun, right, it's more parallel, right? So they just stick their abdomen upright. And similarly, butterflies, right, usually are perched with their wings closed. So general rule of thumb, if you just see like a mysterious lepidopteran, you're not sure if it's a butterfly or a moth, right? If it has its wings closed behind it, it's probably a butterfly. Okay. Now I'm going to show a video about penguins. So people watching from home, you have access to the link. I'm sorry I don't have a way of coordinating this. But feel free to watch it in real time. Otherwise, you've got like a minute break. Just make sure you're on mute. Pretty cool, right? Definitely behavioral thermoregulation there. By the way, same exact thing happens in honeybee colonies, in honeybee hives when they overwinter, right? So queen pretty much stays in the middle. She doesn't have to go on the outside for obvious reasons, but everybody else is rotating through, warming up, cooling off. There's a lot of vibrating their flight muscles, and we'll see more of that in a little bit. Okay, the last category is adjustment of metabolic heat production. Okay, this is something humans do as well. So movement or shivering, right, are these kinds of physiological thermoregulatory adaptations. It's not something that just endotherms do. Some ectotherms can also do it. They also shiver, leading some people to classify these kinds of ectotherms as facultative endotherms. Yeah, so it's good to appreciate the fact that this like ectotherm, endotherm label is something humans have tried to categorize onto biology, right? And we all know at this point, right, biology doesn't care what humans think, you know? So there's always these exceptions, always these kind of gray areas, right? And some of these facultative endotherms fall into that category. So as an example of shivering, I'm just going to show you like a couple of seconds from this video. So I was trying to find a good like honeybee colony shivering video. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there weren't a lot of good inside the colony videos. So I found this dude.
The Groupon app is amazing. With the money I saved, I gotta get a spa day.
So I found footage of this guy holding a microphone to his hive in the dead of winter. And it's pretty active, right? So they are definitely vibrating their flight muscles a lot just to stay warm. Another example of this is with Burmese pythons. So Burmese pythons, when they lay a clutch of eggs, they will actually heat their eggs up with their body. They will flex and their coiling muscles, right? And the number of contractions of those muscles per minute tracks their O2 consumption, right? And also tracks temperature inside the egg cluster. There's also this, so acclimatization also plays a role, right? If you can reasonably expect temperatures, average temperatures to change by season, right? Why not have a totally different phenotype during the winter than you do during the summer? And that's exactly what we see, right? So lots of species shed their winter coats, right? Or they grow a winter coat during the winter, right? For example, wolves. So here's a wolf shedding part of its winter coat. Birds often molt. And then some species just pack their cells with a bunch of different compounds that make them a little bit hardier, or surround themselves with antifreeze-like compounds. So I'll show you a picture or a video of this. This is a water bear. Okay, it's not an insect, but it's an arthropod, so it's a pretty close relative. And these guys are famous. I'm sure you guys have all heard water bear stories at this point, right? You can see them under a microscope. We found some last quarter. Yeah, yeah. So just like any pond sample, pretty much, you might be able to find one. But they're super hardy, right? Very resistant to radiation, and very resistant to freezing. So here is a video of a revived water bear or tardigrade that had been frozen at -20 for 30 years with dramatic music. So note the scale here, they're pretty small. Okay, far too dramatic. Yeah. I don't know, that's the music that would be playing in the background of my head if I had just been revived from 20 years of a deep freeze, 30 years.
We need this music in lab.
Yeah, we do need that during the quizzes. Okay, you get the point. It's alive. It's doing fine. Okay. Tardigrades make this compound called trehalose, which is a sugar, right? Ends in ose, so we know it's a sugar. And it basically, it's like a little glass cocoon for them. Okay. So now I'll ask another Socrative question. For folks playing at home, you should be able to participate in this if you want. And the question is, the temperature difference between arterial and venous blood near the goose's body does what? Have you guys from home been able to follow this pretty well despite all the videos I've been showing? Has it been okay? Okay, good. All right, just about everybody gets B, right? And that's correct, right? It allows the goose to minimize heat loss to the environment, right? It's releasing heat from the arteries anyway. Might as well recover some of that heat from the nearby veins. Okay. Last section for this chapter is bioenergetics, right? So energy requirements are related to size, activity, and the environment. Okay, and the field, or the study that goes into tracking all of these energy exchanges is called bioenergetics. Sorry, got to enunciate. Right, and those overall requirements, those nutrient requirements, will dictate how much food an animal needs to eat per unit time relative to its size, activity, and the external environment. So if we think of ourselves as just like complicated tubes, which is what we are, that are undergoing all these chemical processes, right? We're essentially taking in organic molecules in the form of food. Okay, those molecules contain a ton of chemical potential energy, which we are digesting and absorbing. And the process of digesting and absorbing itself is energetically expensive and costs heat, right? Energy gets released as heat. So we don't actually retain all of that heat. Some of it gets lost to the external environment, right? Anytime you're seeing one of these little red arrows with heat leaving the system, that represents an inefficiency, right? It's the same thing you get when you use your car or turn on your air conditioner, right? You're going to get some waste heat lost. If we didn't, then we could have perpetual motion machines. Okay, so we don't actually use all of the energy from everything that we eat. We lose some of it as fecal material, and if you're not a rabbit or some rodents, you don't then eat it to get more of that energy, but some mammals do that, which is kind of gross. Then we have these nutrients that are broken down in the body. Some of that gets lost via nitrogenous waste. But most of it goes to cellular respiration, right? And as we know, cellular respiration is a pretty efficient cycle, right? But there is heat lost here to make ATP, okay? Other metabolic byproducts are salvaged, right? We use those carbon skeletons to assemble new biomaterials, right? For reproduction, growth, maintenance, et cetera, right? So making new tissues, et cetera. And of course, that costs the ATP we just made, right? And anytime you're doing that, you're performing biosynthetic activities or doing any kind of cellular work where you're contracting muscles, there's going to be waste heat, okay? So we're pretty efficient machines, but there's waste heat. You might be wondering, how do we actually go about calculating just how much energy is used per unit time? Or how do we calculate these metabolic rates, so the amount of energy used per unit time? And the answer is, usually we have to do these really complex things, right? So here's a picture I found on the internet of a woman having her basal metabolic rate tested, right? And you can see she's in like one of those full-on interstellar style spacesuits. Right, and why would that be important, do you think? Why is this like a complicated piece of equipment? Well, good question, right? So like, why isn't it just like a Bane mask? Like, why don't we just put like a face mask over them and we're measuring their, well, what are we measuring? How do you think we measure metabolic rate? Maybe that's a better question.
The amount of heat your body gives off?
Yeah, so that's one way you could do it, right? You could do that with a calorimeter, right? So that is definitely one way they have done it. What else? How else could they do this? Well, it's on the thing.
I mean, beyond the stuff that's...
Yeah, right. So, right, another one is you could measure metabolic byproducts. You can measure CO2 output or oxygen intake. But what about another one? Think long term.
Your feces.
Okay. Yeah. So if we were to weigh all the food we ate and then all of the waste that we excreted, that could be helpful, right, to figure out.
But that wouldn't be accurate though, because a lot of that mass is returned to heat.
Right.
Yeah, so you would lose that amount in the equation.
Right. Right. But you could ultimately establish some kind of baseline metabolic rate even from that data, right? So all of those are viable options. People usually go the route of O2 or CO2 because those are easier to measure than putting someone in like a bomb calorimeter or having like a time course where you weigh their poop for a while, right? So by the way, the picture from I think it's the 8th edition, is terrifying. I don't know if any of you are using the 8th edition, but it's just like this. I don't even remember. It's some kind of grazing mammal, and it's just like set up in this whole big machine. So that actually was like a a friendlier version of the photo. The new edition, they must have gotten some kind of reaction or something because they changed it, and now it's just like a shark in a tank. They're just measuring CO2 levels in the tank. But yeah, so does it make more sense now why you would want to capture like input and output from the whole body? Okay. Was there anything else I wanted to say for this? No. So we have two different phrases, one for endotherms and one for ectotherms. So when you're establishing sort of a baseline or basal metabolic rate, that's for an endotherm. Okay, you usually make this measurement on an animal or a human or human that's not stressed, that's fasting, that's at standard temperature pressure, right? So that's the basal metabolic rate. Standard metabolic rate is for ectotherms. Okay, and it's the same thing, right? Not stressed, having fasted, right, at a specific temperature, depending on what that organism is used to. Okay. So pound for pound, right, if you have two very similarly sized organisms, one's an endotherm, one's an ectotherm, the ectotherm is going to have a much lower standard metabolic rate than the endotherm would have basal metabolic rate. Why? Yeah, why would standard metabolic rate for, let's say we have a lizard that's the same size of a mouse. Mouse's basal metabolic rate is much higher than lizard's standard metabolic rate. They're the same size. Why is that different? Right. They have to keep a stable body temperature. Like a lizard is fine just going with whatever external environmental temperature is there, right? But to maintain homeostasis, that mouse has to be burning calories, which costs energy, which affects metabolic rate. Okay, but it's not the only factor that affects metabolic rate. Turns out size matters, as does activity. Okay, so metabolic rate per gram is inversely related to body size. So that means the amount of energy needed to keep a single cell from an elephant shrew alive is higher than the amount of energy required to keep a single cell of an elephant alive. Okay, so smaller animals tend to have higher metabolic rates per kilogram, right, per unit size. Not overall. It's not like a hummingbird needs more calories than an elephant. No, not true. If you were to shrink an elephant, no, that wouldn't be true either. But do you see what I mean, right? Like, it's the elephant is more economical with its metabolism, if that makes more sense. Alex?
So is the standard like kilocal per hour, per minute, like?
Yeah, so I'll show you a chart in a second, but it can be liters of O2 per hour or liters of O2 per hour per kilogram. Okay, so if you have a higher metabolic rate per gram, right, you're a smaller animal, you probably need a faster or higher oxygen delivery rate. You probably have a faster rate of inhalation and exhalation. You have a faster heart rate. You have a greater blood volume relative to your body size compared to a larger animal. Okay, so when you think of all these like little tiny hummingbirds, hoverflies, elephant shrews, Bats, right? They're all really tiny and they have really high metabolic demands, right? A vampire bat will die within 72 hours if it doesn't get a blood meal. Okay. So if we were to plot out the body mass of various mammals, okay, note the logarithmic scale on the x-axis here, and compare it to the basal metabolic rate. This is not per kilogram. This is the entire basal metabolic rate in liters of oxygen per hour, again on a log scale. What you can see is that all of these mammals sort of line up so you can trace roughly a straight line through them. If something looks linear on a log-log scale, that means it follows what's called a power law. Okay, so your textbook mentions metabolic rate is about proportional to body mass to the 3/4 power. So you don't have to know this, right? But I just appreciate the fact that this is not a linear relationship, even though it looks linear, right? It's on a log-log scale, so it's actually exponential, or follows a power law.
So,
Yeah.
is this at all related to like lifespan? Because I was thinking about like, like really tiny animals like flies and how they live for like a week or something like that, or like bigger animals. But then there's like tortoises, which seem to live a lot longer. So like, I guess maybe that's not right.
Yeah, it's confusing. So senescence. There are a lot of reasons that could provide strong selective pressure for something to evolve a longer or shorter lifespan. And yes, lifespans evolve. That is a trait that can evolve in a population. So it doesn't seem to be as tightly correlated to body size. Something that does correlate to body size, though, is amount of sleep required. So that's kind of an interesting one, right? So the smaller the organism, the more sleep it tends to require. So things like horses, cows, elephants don't need nearly as much sleep even as humans do. So, yeah. But you would think the opposite, but it's not true.
Well, but like you don't know anything about sleep.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, so there are a lot of hypotheses as to why that's the case, right? But yeah, with senescence, I don't think there is a super strong pattern there. Yeah. It has more to do with things like extrinsic mortality, and so like if you're more likely to if you do things that are going to get you killed a lot, it makes sense strategically, right, in an evolutionary sense, for you to invest in having a lot of kids, even if having a lot of kids costs you life, right? So yeah, why don't we do this? This is fun. Okay, so Spencer has a mutation allows him to live forever. Okay, right? Congratulations, Spencer. I have a mutation that allows me to have one more kid in my lifespan than Spencer has in his lifespan. Guess what's going to happen over evolutionary time, right? My descendants are going to increase in frequency at a faster rate than Spencer's descendants are, even if he's staying alive and continuing to have those number of kids per generation, right? If I have a mutation that just at all increases my reproductive success a tiny bit at the expense of my lifespan, it'll still increase in frequency. Okay, so sorry, next up, let's look at another plot. This one probably will be a little bit easier for you to interpret with your eye without thinking about it for a long time. So we've still got body mass on the x-axis, still a log scale on the x-axis, right? So this is 1 kilogram, this is 10, and then that's 100, right, and so on. Okay, so it's increasing by orders of magnitude. That's what we mean by a log scale. Okay, but the y-axis is now on a linear scale, behaves as you would expect. Okay, so what we're seeing is on the y-axis, we have basal metabolic rate now, but per kilogram. Okay, so what this is saying is that per kilogram, the metabolic rate for a shrew is way higher, or quite a bit higher, than it is for a rat, cat, dog, right? And the lowest per kilogram metabolic rate of all of those mammals is the elephant, which is also the largest. Does that make more sense? Okay. So if I ask you to interpret any of those plots, it'll probably be this one and not the log-log plot.
What slide number is this?
63 for now.
Thanks.
Yeah. But I update the PowerPoints like all the time.
Oh,
Yeah. Speaking of updates, I will send out an announcement about this, but I added an objective to chapter 40, and I added an objective to either chapter 39. That couldn't have been because we already did 39. Must have been 40 and 41. Yeah. So, but I'll like let you know when those objectives are finalized. Okay. So what a particular species dedicates its energy budget to also varies. So we have some species that invest a lot of their metabolism in just like normal, regular maintenance, right? Just like staying alive, not dying, right? Takes more of the pie to not die as a human than it does to not die as a deer mouse. Okay? But takes more of the pie to thermoregulate if you're a deer mouse than it does if you're a human. But it is worth thinking about these kinds of activities, right? The daily life of these organisms in terms of a budget, right? Because it really is. They have a limited number of calories. They can only acquire so many calories per day, right? And what they do with those calories really matters. So, for instance, you often hear this expression of life history trade-offs. Has anybody ever heard that? Life history trade-offs? Okay. So life history traits are just like anything, pretty much anything about an organism, right? Number of offspring it has, average lifespan, right? Average size as an adult. Those are all life history traits, okay? And there are trade-offs between any of those life history traits. It's like making a character in a Dungeons and Dragons game, right? You can't have, plus 10 intelligence, plus 10 dexterity, plus 10 strength, right? You can't just make this like amazing character. You have a limited number of points or calories or whatever to allocate to various life history traits, okay? Which is why you often see these trade-offs between things like lifespan and average number of offspring, things like that. Okay. You can't just be the perfect organism. Okay. Another really cool concept I want to either introduce you to or remind you about is this idea of torpor. Right? So torpor is a physiological state where metabolic activity is decreased. Okay, and some organisms go into torpor when there's a temperature change. So if you take ants, for example, and you put them in a refrigerator, they'll slow down quite a bit and eventually go into torpor. Bats, many bat species go into torpor every night. Some birds do too. So occasionally you can if you're in the tropics, right, and you see birds just like sleeping in the canopy, right? They're basically dead, right? Chickens, same way, right? Chickens turn off at sundown, right? They just stop being alive. They don't, right? You know what I mean, right? They go into torpor. So torpor, why would you have that? Why would you, as a chicken, why is it adaptive to basically be non-functional exactly when the raccoons come out, right? And the answer is it's an energetics thing, right? It has to do with budgeting your energy, okay? So some species go into torpor to avoid really dangerous environments, right? So if it gets too cold, then just shut down your metabolic activity. There's not going to be food to find anyway. Might as well slow down how much food you need. Or if it's really hot, right? Same reason. Have trouble finding food. Everything's dry. And we use a different word to describe long-term torpor. Where you draw the line between what is hibernation and what is torpor is totally arbitrary.
So some species may just have like month-long torpor, whatevers.
You would probably call that hibernation if it's that long.
Because it's, at least from the description of like of that overnight, it seems like it'd be like a daily thing or like weekly.
Yeah. So exactly what time spans qualify as one or the other isn't super clear to me, and I don't think so. I was doing some research on this hibernating or estivating primate, and like fully half of the research articles, the actual like original research articles described it as hibernation, and the other half didn't. So yeah, so it's just like people just call it whatever they want to call it. It seems. I mean, maybe there's a really technical term, or the technical definition, but I'm not familiar with it.
Would a possum, would that be considered torpor? Like when they...
I don't know about hot possums. That's a really good question. I'll look that up. Oh, if it's like a predation defense response, no, that wouldn't be considered torpor. I don't know what possums do when they sleep, or I don't know what they do at night.
I think they move around at night, but like they play dead. Like sometimes when I see a possum, I thought it was dead.
Yeah, that's more of a defense thing. Yeah. So the weevils, like little beetles, do that too. If you like poke them, they'll just play dead.
Yeah, those little ones that ball up.
Yeah, well, not the roly-polies, but actual beetles with snouts. Anyway, okay, I found two really cool examples of species that undergo hibernation. Some people use the word estivation. To describe hibernation that's not during the winter. So think about it as like summertime hibernation. So one example of an estivating mammal is this, what are they called? Dwarf-tailed lemurs? Crosley's dwarf lemur. Okay, these guys were discovered estivating in 2010. That's what it was. It's not in the notes. I just remembered that. So while I was in grad school, right, they realized that there was a primate that hibernates, which is crazy, okay? So they basically found, imagine just like digging through the woods in Madagascar and like finding a hibernating lemur underground, right? It was crazy, right? So I remember like the news articles caught up like 3 years later. So like all the news about these things didn't really hit until, the next sort of viral phase of this stuff. So in around 2012, 2013, everybody was just like, oh my God, there's a hibernating primate. We're gonna go to space. Everyone's just like, we're gonna figure out how to like shut down all of our metabolic processes and go to space, right? And as far as I know, like I haven't heard any news about any of these hibernating lemurs since then, but yeah, it is kind of a cool, promising thing to appreciate the fact that even primates can undergo these kinds of reduced metabolic activity. And if you look at these guys, if you look at pictures of them, they have these crazy, like weird stubby tails that are just like swollen with fat, right? So almost the same way camels, right, have their humps made of fat, right? These lemurs just have like really fatty tails, right? And it's because they go through these times of scarcity, right? And they have to go through estivation, so probably helps to have a nice fat repository. Another species that goes through seasonal estivation are these snails. And they are called, what's their full name? Common name is the white garden snail or the sandhill snail or the white Italian snail. So these are snails that are endemic to the Mediterranean coast. And obviously it gets pretty hot and dry during the summer months in the Mediterranean coast. And they will basically go into estivation. So it's not just for vertebrates. All right, so just to get a sense of like how much metabolic energy hibernation or estivation actually saves, here's basically what happens. So this is a really complicated plot. Again, they're plotting several things on the same axis, which drives me nuts. But so we've got the outside air temperature, right? So during these cold months, outside air temperature is getting pretty cold, right? It's getting pretty low. Within the burrow, right? I guess this is a ground squirrel. Is it Belding's ground squirrel? Belding's ground squirrel. So the burrows also cool down, right? But not quite as cold as the outside environment, which makes sense. Okay, and then you're looking at the body temperature of the ground squirrel, right? It stays really high. These guys are clearly endotherms during the summer months, right? But when they start hibernating, the body temperature plummets almost to the actual burrow temperature, right? So they're going pretty low. So hibernation is usually associated with these like around 2-week bouts of arousal, right, where the metabolic activity will ramp back up before they pass out again, ramp back up, and they pass out again. So they kind of become active for just a short period of time, and they go right back down. Okay, so that's why it looks like a comb. So if you were to look at or to take the area of the space that would otherwise be occupied, right, by these changes in body temperature, you can get a better sense of like how many calories these guys are saving by hibernating. Does that make sense? Okay, Alex.
I'm curious. I always thought that like body temperature, like maintaining your body temperature, was like really important, primarily for the like chemical reactions and like enzyme activity and stuff like that. And it just seems weird to me that like you can just decide to not have to maintain these things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question, right? So what physiologically has to happen to buffer or protect all of those more sensitive enzymes is a wonderful question that I do not know the answer to. But that's a really good point. Yeah, like how does that not just break everything in their body? Let's take a 5-minute break, and I'll start again at 6:05. All right, it's 6:06. Let's start back up. We've got a couple of Socrative questions, and then we are done with this chapter. Okay, next question is. She's just thermoregulating. Which offers the best time to measure basal metabolic rate? I have your short answer sections to hand back to you. Don't let me forget to do that today, please. Actually, it was the highest mean so far of 211, 212, 213. So you guys, that was the best performance. Don't even need to curve. Like you guys did great.
Are the grades up or not yet?
Not yet. Yeah, still waiting for the wishes stuff. Which, by the way, if you have your wishes stuff, definitely please resubmit that. Okay. All right, yeah, so if you wanted to measure basal metabolic rate, you wouldn't have to use a baby. I hope that's clear, all right? But if you wanted to do it on a baby, you could, right? But you would do it before they ate, right? So on a fast. Okay. Basal metabolic rate is referring just to endotherms, right? So B is an ectotherm, so that's right out. And after a meal is not a good time to measure somebody's basal metabolic rate, right? Because they are performing a lot of metabolic activity that they wouldn't normally be doing.
If they're like watching TV and like it's a horror movie and they get scared.
Totally. Exactly. Who knows? All right, so we've got a mouse and a lizard. They have the same body mass, and we measured their metabolic rates over a range of temperatures, right? So this is kind of an interesting experiment. Does metabolic activity change with temperature? Which one do you think is the lizard, and which do you think is the mouse? To be more accurate. Okay, let's take a look. All right, so A is the mouse, B is the lizard. Why is this the case? Well, as temperature gets really low, a mouse is going to have to like ramp up a lot to keep its stable body temperature, right? So to maintain homeostasis, it's going to have to ramp up its metabolic rate, whereas a lizard would just decline in metabolic rate with temperature. Literal chill right there. Okay, that was a bad joke. Okay, let's move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 41. All right, Kevin and Morgan, give me a thumbs up if you guys can see the new PowerPoint. Awesome. Okay. All right. So chapter 41 is animal nutrition. There are 5 sections. We'll just talk about sort of the essential everything, right? It's everything that an animal has to eat to not die. Then we will talk about the various phases of food processing: ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. Then we'll talk about the organs that are involved in those processes for mammals. We'll talk about some adaptations for vertebrate digestive systems and how those adaptations clearly correlate with diet. And then in the very end, we'll talk about feedback circuits. Let's start with the first bullet point. Okay. So in order to continue surviving and reproducing, right, animals have to take in nutrients, digest them, break them down, absorb them. And the way that an animal does that falls into roughly 3 categories, right? An animal can be either an herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore. Herbivores eat mainly autotrophs, so plants and algae. Carnivores eat other animals. And omnivores sample from both of those categories, right? So they regularly consume animals as well as plants. Again, this is humans trying to categorize things that are difficult to categorize. So we call certain things like deer and cattle herbivores, despite the fact that they will occasionally eat insects, eggs, right, etc. I don't know.
I've seriously seen a video of some guy like feeding a deer a piece of meat, and it was just like totally happy to eat it.
Yeah.
You can also find videos of deer snatching birds out of the air.
Yeah. So there. Turns out life is complicated, right? So a lot of species are opportunistic with their nutrition. Cannibal. No.
No bears. They eat the young and
So they would definitely qualify as omnivores for sure. Okay. So no matter what you are, herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, right, you need to do the following things, right? You need to eat or consume chemical energy. Okay, so usually this is in the form of carbohydrates, proteins, lipids. All of those, when you break them down, right, via catabolism, right, you are releasing chemical energy. Okay, so that's requirement 1, chemical energy. Requirement 2, let me pull this up a second. Oh, I didn't number these. Organic building blocks. Okay, so most of this is from organic carbon or organic nitrogen, right? So things, nitrates, nitrites, as well as carbohydrates. Okay, you need something, you need these atoms to construct your own biomolecules with. Okay, so you need the building parts to make your complex biomolecules, DNA, carbohydrates, etc. And then the third thing you need are essential nutrients. Okay, so an essential nutrient is anything that's required that you can't synthesize yourself from simpler biomolecules. Okay. Okay, so again, we've got chemical energy. How was the other one phrased? Organic building blocks. And then 3 are essential nutrients. Okay. So there are 4 different kinds of essential nutrients. We've got essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals. So the objective on chapter 41 about this just asks you to be able to provide one example of each of these. Okay, so I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list of all of these, especially the vitamins, because there's a lot of vitamins. But definitely do refer to the tables in your textbook. I also included in this lecture, there's like a tables section at the very end of the lecture. Okay. Doesn't mean I'm not going to talk about this. All right. So essential amino acids. So different animals have different metabolic pathways. So some animals can synthesize some amino acids that other animals can't, and vice versa. Humans in particular, right? So roughly, animals can synthesize about half of the amino acids in their diet, right? And it'll change from species to species. For humans, there are, what is it, 3, 6, 8, with a 9 for infants, right? So humans can't synthesize their own isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, or valine. And as infants, we also can't synthesize our own histidine, right? But we can synthesize our own all of those. Okay, and those are the 20 amino acids that we need to make any protein in our body.
You said above the line we can synthesize?
No, the left, this category, we can make our own.
Oh, okay.
This category, we have to get these in full from other things.
You can't get some of them from like lagoons, right?
Yeah, so you couldn't continue surviving forever if your diet consisted entirely of corn, for instance, right? Because corn does not contain tryptophan or lysine. You couldn't continue surviving and being healthy long term if all you ate were beans, right? No one would like that. But also, you wouldn't get methionine, right? But if you supplement, right, so it is possible to be vegan or vegetarian and be healthy, right, and have, right? You would just have to switch it up. Say it again.
Nothing. Just you're supporting Connor.
It's best to eat them at the same time.
There you go. Yeah, mix them up.
I have a really random question.
Yeah.
A lot of people talk about folic acid. Does this have to do with anything we're talking about here?
It will. Not yet, but
Okay.
yeah, we will talk about that. So that's one of the vitamins. Okay, so if you don't get these amino acids, that gives you a protein deficiency, right? So if you go to parts of the world, right, where protein deficiencies are common, someone can have an embarrassment of carbohydrates, right, and just not have all of the correct amino acids, not have all of the essential amino acids. And if somebody has that protein deficiency, one of the protein deficiencies is called kwashiorkor, right? Which I found out today doing research, it's some language in Ghana. It means like, what happens to a baby when your mom has another baby, right? Or something like that. Like that's the phrase. So basically, it's this protein deficiency that results.
When you have a child too quick.
Yeah, basically when you have to wean off, right, a kid. So if you've seen any of those pictures, like or ads on TV, maybe this doesn't happen with your generation. But we used to see ads on TV all the time with like kids from these countries where they had like really distended bellies, right? And you would look at it and you wouldn't immediately think that this was some sort of malnutrition, right? Because it looks like they have these like big, full, distended bellies, right? But that's the phenotype that's associated with kwashiorkor, right? With protein deficiency. Oh, it means the sickness the baby gets when the new baby comes. Okay. So meats, eggs, cheeses, etc., they do contain all of the essential amino acids.
Wait, they do have all of them?
They do, yes. They are complete proteins. So obviously some animals have adaptations that they take advantage of to deal with sort of differences in availability of proteins. So this is an Adelie penguin, and the problem with an Adelie penguin is that it has to molt, right? It has to replace old damaged feathers, or else it can't thermoregulate correctly. If it can't thermoregulate correctly, it can't go fishing, right? And it can't get new calories. But now it's in a catch-22, right? Because if it molts, it can't go fishing. If it can't go fishing, it doesn't have proteins to grow new feathers. Crap. How does it deal with that? Well, basically, they bulk up, right? They basically they accumulate a lot of muscle mass before they molt, and then they break down the proteins in that muscle mass to provide the amino acids to synthesize new feathers, right? So you'll just see like these Adelaide penguins just kind of getting swole and then molting. Exactly. All right, so that's it for essential amino acids. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you're ever asked, like, what does it mean to be a complete protein? It basically means that if you would just to eat that, you would get all the essential amino acids. Okay, so essential fatty acids, your book spends like a paragraph talking about, right? So animals can synthesize just about every essential fatty acid they need. With two exceptions. So humans can't make linoleic acid, and they can't make alpha linoleic acid. So they have to get those from their diet. Those are found in seeds, grains, veggies. So they are omegas, but there are other omegas that we can synthesize. Right? And I think the reason the book does not emphasize this is because deficiencies in fatty acids are rare. So it's actually tough to not get access to essential fatty acids. Okay. Vitamins. So a vitamin is what we use to describe any organic molecule that is required in our diet. We would eventually die if we did not get it. Right? But we need really usually small quantities for this to be sufficient. So think about it as essentially the micronutrients for humans, right? For animals. So far they have found 13 vitamins that are essential to humans. And they roughly fall into two categories, water-soluble and fat-soluble. I don't even want you to find an example of each. I just want you to be able to name one vitamin. Okay, so you'll be fine. So as an example, right, a water-soluble vitamin would be B2. B2 gets converted into FAD. Does anybody remember what FAD is used for? Yeah, right? So that's the one that's accepting electrons during the electron transport chain during aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, so just like NAD, FAD is doing that. Okay, so you can't make FAD unless you have B2. As a fat-soluble example, vitamin A, right, which is involved in helping to synthesize a bunch of pigments in your eyes, right? So people who have vitamin A deficiencies can go blind. You guys heard about golden rice? Is that a thing?
Yeah.
You've heard about, right? So golden rice is a genetically engineered rice that synthesizes vitamin A, right? The idea being to provide more vitamin A to regions that are vitamin A poor. Another example is vitamin D. So vitamin D is a weird one because humans can technically synthesize their own vitamin D, but they have to have access to sunlight to do so. Okay. So depending on where you live, that might be tough. Yeah. And also depending on how melanized your skin is, it can be tough to synthesize more vitamin D. Okay. So that's it for vitamins. Minerals. Okay, so just like plants, we do require minerals. The 8th edition and the 10th edition, I think, are a little bit different in the way they structure these tables. The 8th edition has all of these, right? So from calcium to magnesium, and then iron on the bottom, and then puts all of these other sort of trace elements on a separate table. The new edition puts a couple of these onto this main table along with iron, and then just asterisks and mentions all the other ones. Okay, again, I just want you to be able to name one example. Shouldn't be too tough.
Do we also need to name the function, or
I will let you know.
The name.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
They have a function, you said?
Who's in charge here? Okay. Okay, anyway, so speaking to Melanie's question about folic acid, so they did these studies where they took infants and supplemented the infants with vitamins and didn't and noticed. So this is called a contingency table. Sometimes it's called a case control table, right, where you have some sort of disease outcome or some disease phenotype and a treatment versus a control. Okay, so vitamins, number of people studied. So usually it's not like that. It's usually number of healthy versus number of affected, number of healthy versus number of affected. But you get the idea. It's the same sort of general pattern. So who wants to interpret this for me?
So this 0.7% of 141 or 41.
Mm-hmm.
They gave them synthetic folic acid, right? Like in a form.
Mm-hmm. And what happens?
They have a defect after taking, because they can't synthesize it, or less have a defect? I don't know. I'm not sure.
They synthesize something that causes them to have, like, less of them to have defects. Without the synthetic thing.
Exactly. Exactly, right? So if you don't give them vitamins, right, there's a much higher rate of these neural tube defects, and we'll talk more about those in like several chapters when we get to like chapter 47, right? Which are, surprise, right, bad defects to have as an infant, right? But the cases go way down when you start supplementing with vitamins, right? And they did follow-up studies, so this is getting to what Melanie was saying, where they just tested folic acid, and folic acid alone explained the entire pattern. So they were just like, oh, it's folic acid. That's super important. Okay.
There's this girl that I know, she said that synthetic, this is crazy, I'm not sure if it's true or not, synthetic folic acid, some kids have a gene that they're not able to process the synthetic folic acid, and it causes autism, she said.
What is synthetic folic acid? How is that different from folic acid?
The one made in the factory.
Okay.
So you give to
But I
kids.
mean, folic acid is folic acid. Unless it's like it's delivered in some interesting way or made bioavailable somehow. It sounds like a lot of bullshit.
Yeah.
Throwing that
I
out there.
didn't really understand her. I only understood parts of what she was saying. So that's why it caught my attention, folic acid. I was like, oh, okay.
A lot of what she says is
Talk about
bullshit.
Because a substance is a substance. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, like here's some synthetic water. You know what I mean? Like it's you can make water, but it's water. Yeah. But so see if she knows more. I would be interested to know whether there are defects that just make an infant unable to metabolize folic acid. Period.
It was like a gene, she said. I forgot the name of the gene.
Okay. If you don't mind following up with me, I'm like legit curious about that. So.
Okay, sure.
Okay, thanks.
Isn't there some deal though with like kind of like is it the amino acids where it's like left-handed and right-handed? Something about the way.
So it could be, yeah, right. If you have a synthetic pathway, it makes a racemic mixture, right? And you don't have any way of isolating the bioactive one. But usually the one that's not bioactive isn't harmful, and you just metabolize it, or you don't, it just passes through. So usually that's not a problem, but I wonder too. Maybe you're right. Yeah, that's a good point. We'll get to the bottom of that somehow. Okay, so speaking of, right, so all of these minerals can get acquired in different ways. Some organisms can respond to mineral deficiencies, right? Probably the most famous one, the one that was in your textbook, is these salt licks, right? So you have a lot of grazers, things like deer, right? Moose, elk, etc., right, are actually like taking up minerals from rocky or salty substrates, right? So some weird behavior. This is not limited to mammals. So if you ever come across something like this near a stream bed or on a sappy tree or something like that, just like a weird congregation of butterflies. It seems very fern gully, but what's actually happening is they're just like trying to extract minerals from whatever that puddle is. Okay.
That was so pregnant with like deep clay. No, it's for real. I'm not even joking.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, I know I personally know someone that there's like this African store that actually sells clay.
I have heard this, yes.
And I saw her eating it, and I was like, why does it taste so good to her? So I took some, and I tried it, and it's like,
Dirt, clay.
it tastes kind of good, though.
Okay. Okay.
But pregnant people eat clay.
So I have heard this. So even things like clay eating aren't limited to humans. So bee eaters, which are a bird,
But I don't do it anymore.
have I'm glad to hear it. They also sample clay, right? But they do it to regulate their pH, right, and mitigate pathogens. So
But is there a connection to craving and stuff?
I don't know. I don't know whether like clay craving is a thing.
I'm just talking about in general, like, is there a connection between deficiency, mineral deficiencies and craving?
I wonder. I wouldn't be surprised. That seems like a good story.
I mean, if you're pregnant, I assume your body wants some things
Yeah.
extra.
Yeah.
I mean, the deer is not like, doesn't have any kind of apparatus to tell it that you need.
I'm low on, yeah.
I'm low on salt, like I need to
Yeah. All right, let's do like I don't know. Do you think you guys can do this in 5 minutes?
Yeah.
5-minute partner activity. Partner 1, name and provide an example of the first 2 classes of essential nutrients. Partner 2, name and provide an example of the second 2 classes of essential nutrients. Put your names on it. If you want to work with Crystal or something. And for those of you watching at home, I'll accept your wishes, Scantrons on Wednesday, and I'll return the Scantrons then. Okay, I'm going to resume. Okay, so next bullet point is food processing involves ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. Bless you. Ingestion is just the act of eating. Okay, there's a couple of different ways to eat. If you're an animal, you could be a suspension feeder, right? If you're a suspension feeder, that means you sift small food particles from the water, right? Filter feeding is a subset of suspension feeding, right, where you're like actively capturing or trapping. So think spiders would be bulk. Well, I mean, actually, maybe spiders would be liquid feeders. Right, but things like baleen whales. So there's like 16 species of whales that forage with these baleens, right, which are just these bony filters that they use to filter things like krill out of the water column and eat.
What about like, is that a suspension feeder?
Probably not. Yeah. Maybe. I don't know. We can find lots of examples of things I don't know. Substrate feeders. So we're already bringing to point, right, that some of these, again, are gray area, right? So earthworms might be substrate feeders, but they also might be bulk feeders, and I'm not quite sure which one they're categorized into. Substrate feeders are things that eat the thing they live in or live on. Okay, so good examples of this are some lepidopterans will mine, so they will live. They're small enough to live inside the leaf. I repeat, inside a leaf. Okay, and they'll just chew their way through the leaf. So if you ever see any of these like weird sort of skeleton tracks inside of a leaf, that's from a mining insect, which was either a butterfly, a moth, or a fly. Okay, another example of a substrate feeder. Something that's an endoparasite, right? So any parasite that lives inside of its host would be a substrate feeder. Yeah.
Would you like? How would you define like whales or something like that? I guess because the krill is found in their water.
So they're suspension feeders. Yeah. Yeah, so again, tapeworms. I don't know. Yeah, that would be tough. It's hard, yeah. Another example of a substrate feeder, termites, right? Then we've got fluid feeders. Tapeworms seem to fall into all of these categories. So fluid feeders suck nutrient-rich fluid from a host. So things like mosquitoes, ticks. But also things that aren't parasites. Can anybody think of a non-parasitic fluid feeder? Doesn't have to be an animal host. Hummingbirds, right? Bees, aphids, yep. Exactly. Cicadas, etc. I am a little bit terrified because I don't remember what this video is. Please be cool and not terrifying. Oh. So this is a moth that drinks the tears of a bird. Because it's delicious. And this bird is just, it's asleep, right? Sweet dreams, everybody. Tears of my enemies. Okay. So I was getting text messages on my video recorder. All right, then we've got bulk feeders. Right, and these guys eat relatively large pieces of food. So yes, things like snakes, of course, but also animals like humans are considered bulk feeders. Right? So your meal doesn't have to be larger than you. It just has to be like large chunks. Okay, so those are the different ways of ingesting. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of gray area there. Okay. But then we have digestion, which is the process of breaking food down into individual molecules, right, that are small enough to absorb. So simple carbohydrates, amino acids, etc. Okay. There's mechanical digestion, right, which involves chewing, right, or like grinding with a gizzard or something like that. But then there's also chemical digestion, which is enzymatic, right? It involves hydrolysis, right? Using water to split apart these more complex molecules, stuff you guys learned in 211. After there's digestion, you have to absorb those broken down nutrients, right? So you're uptaking those nutrients, and then you have to eliminate the things that aren't uptaken, okay? So waste material out of the digestive compartment, okay? Here's how it might look in mammalian vertebrate. So here's a cat eating food, right? Mechanical digestion is occurring, then chemical digestion is occurring. So then you have small molecules that are absorbed in the small intestines mostly, and then undigested material is eliminated. Okay, so most animals have specialized compartments that do various parts of these processes, right? That do various parts of the digestion in particular. And having these specialized compartments, whether they're intracellular, inside the cell, so think like the food vacuole fusing with the lysosome, do you guys remember that? Right? That's still digestion, okay? Or whether it's extracellular, right? You do it in a cavity, right? Stomach or intestines, et cetera. Either way, having a specialized compartment for it prevents your body from breaking down and digesting itself. Okay, so as mentioned, right, we have intracellular and extracellular digestion. Intracellular is food particles that are engulfed by a process, endocytosis, right, bringing in big things into the cell, and digested within food vacuoles, usually by fusion with some other kind of vesicle, like a lysosome, that contains enzymes for breaking down those materials. So an animal like a sponge does all of its digestion entirely by intracellular digestion. Okay, so sponges don't have a gastrovascular cavity. They certainly don't have an alimentary canal, right? They're just a bunch of cells that are doing intracellular digestion by themselves. Okay, extracellular digestion happens in most of the other animals, right? In addition to intracellular digestion. And it's the breakdown of food particles outside of cells. So there are specialized chambers, sometimes many specialized chambers, that are involved in that process. So if we move along our phylogenetic tree, right, starting from our simplest animals, like the sponges, to the slightly more complex diploblasts, right, we have things like hydras and jellyfish, right, that do have a designated cavity for digestion. Okay? That cavity is called a gastrovascular cavity because not only is it involved in digestion, it's also involved in transporting those nutrients to other parts of the body. Okay? Easy to do if you don't have a super complex body. Okay, the other thing to note about a gastrovascular cavity is it's called a cavity, right? Which means it only has one hole, which means that everything gets digested. What's left is the waste product, and that gets expelled through the gastrovascular cavity as well. Okay, there are a couple of more details about that in the comments section if you want to take a look at that, but they're not in the learning objectives. All right. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Note that there is no quiz this coming week. So Josephine's class has like a teaching thing. So they're not meeting. So it's going to be like very low stakes, easy, probably won't take a long time on Wednesday.
Does autophagy count as digestion?
Does what?
Autophagy?
Autophagy?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's a type of digestion?
I would call that a digestion, yeah.
Or like any animals? Like just for yeast, or is it like
So, I mean, even things like apoptosis, right, are in a sense digestive, right, because you're releasing hydrolytic enzymes. So I would still count that, right? Those materials are going somewhere else to be used.
Okay.
Thank you. Oh, I'll take your participation papers.